In the midst of the dry wind, a man drops his rifle when he hears the creak of a rope, and what he finds hanging from the mesquite will change everything. A dog appears, sniffs the life that remains, and nothing will ever be the same. The dirt road stretched like a dry scar across the forgotten belly of a Kentucky farm that held more secrets than head of cattle. It was there, on a colorless evening, that the harsh sound of rope creaking met the solitude of a man who preferred talking to the silence of the woods rather than wasting words on those who wouldn't listen. Between twisted branches, a young woman swayed gently, closer to sleep than to life, held by a makeshift gallows that lacked the courage to complete its punishment. The iron-burned sign pressed against her chest left no doubt about the sentence. Shame was all she was to those who hung her there, believing the road would swallow her body and the wind would carry her name away without return. Jake Whitmore had been tracking deer through these hills for 37 years, reading signs in broken twigs and disturbed earth that most folks missed entirely. The old hunting jacket hung loose on his shoulders now, worn thin from decades of dawn hunts and evening walks through timber that knew his footsteps better than any church pew ever had. His weathered hands, scarred from years of field dressing, game and splitting firewood, moved with practiced certainty as he adjusted the rifle strap across his back. But today, something different hung in the air between the oak trees. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Tell us which city you're watching from. Let's keep going. The rope groaned against the branch like an old barn door in a storm, and Jake stopped dead in his tracks. His grey eyes, sharp as winter morning, took in the scene with the cold. Assessment of a man who'd seen war and weather strip away most of what folks called important. The girl couldn't be more than 19, maybe 20, her auburn hair matted against pale skin that spoke of too many days without proper sunlight. The crude wooden sign tied around her neck bore a single word burned deep into the pine: shame. But she was breathing. Shallow, irregular breaths that barely moved her chest, but breathing nonetheless. Jake approached slowly, the way he'd learned, to move around wounded animals, knowing that pain made even gentle creatures dangerous. His boots crunched on fallen leaves as he circled the tree, studying the knots, the height of the rope, the angle of her body. This wasn't the work of someone who knew their business. This was the clumsy handiwork of people who wanted to send a message more than they wanted to finish the job. As Jake reached up to check her pulse, a low growl rumbled from the underbrush. A blue-tick coonhound emerged from the shadows, his coat mottled gray and black, eyes clouded with age but alert with purpose. The dog had been following Jake for the better part of 3 weeks now, appearing and disappearing like smoke, never getting close enough to touch, but never straying far enough to forget. "Easy, old boy," Jake murmured, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he lifted the girl's weight to ease the pressure on her throat. "Looks like we both found something worth keeping." The dog, who Jake had taken to calling Blue on account of his coloring, padded closer and sat at the base of the tree, tilting his grizzled muzzle toward the sky. A howl started low in his throat, mournful and ancient, carrying across the valley, like a prayer said in a language older than words. Jake worked quickly, using his hunting knife to cut through the rope while supporting the girl's unconscious form. She was lighter than she should have been, all sharp angles and hollow places that spoke of meals missed and kindness withheld. When he lifted her onto his shoulders, she stirred slightly, a small sound escaping her lips that might have been a name or might have been a plea. The old coonhound fell into step beside them as Jake picked his way through the forest, following deer trails and creek beds that wound deeper into the hills. Blue seemed to know where they were headed before Jake did, occasionally ranging ahead to sniff at fallen logs or pause at stream crossings, waiting with the patience of something that understood time differently than most creatures. They walked for nearly an hour through thickening woods, past abandoned homesteads where chimney stones stood like grave markers and wild roses grew through broken windows. The girl's breathing grew stronger against Jake's neck, and once she mumbled something about water, about someone named Thomas, about being sorry for something she couldn't quite name. As the last light filtered through the canopy, they emerged into a clearing that Jake had never seen before, though he'd walked these hills since boyhood. 7 women sat around a fire that burned steady and bright despite the evening dampness, as if they'd been expecting visitors. They ranged in age from perhaps 25 to past 70, their faces marked by the kind of weathering that came from lives lived mostly outdoors, mostly alone. The side eldest, a woman with silver hair braided down her back and hands that spoke of decades spent coaxing life from stubborn ground, rose as Jake approached. Her eyes, dark as creek water in winter, took in the unconscious girl, the makeshift sign still hanging around her neck, the old dog that had appointed himself guardian without invitation. "Mother Ruth," one of the younger women whispered, but the older woman raised a hand for silence. "Bring her here," Mother Ruth said simply, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Mary, Catherine, get the clean blankets. Emma, put more water on to boil. The rest of you, clear space by the fire." Jake knelt and gently lowered the girl onto a pile of quilts that appeared as if by magic. The women moved around him with practiced efficiency, cutting away the rope and the shameful sign, examining wounds and bruises with hands that had clearly done this kind of work before. Blue settled himself at the edge of the firelight, close enough to watch, but far enough away to avoid getting underfoot. "She's got marks on her wrists," observed a red-haired woman, Jake figured to be about 40, her fingers tracing faded rope burns with gentle precision. This wasn't the first time someone tried to tie her up. Mother Ruth nodded grimly as she cleaned dirt and dried blood from the girl's face. "Some folks got a powerful need to punish what they don't understand. Usually because they're afraid. It might be catching." Jake stood at the edge of the circle, uncertain whether he was welcome to stay or expected to leave. He'd delivered his burden, done what any decent person would do when they found someone in need. But something about the way the old dog had claimed a spot by the fire, and the way Mother Ruth's eyes had taken his measure without finding him wanting, suggested that this was only the beginning of whatever story was unfolding here. The girls, eyes fluttered open just as full darkness settled over the clearing. They were green as spring leaves, but haunted in a way that reminded Jake of deer he'd sometimes found caught in wire fences, alive but resigned to whatever came next. She looked around at the circle of faces, at the warm fire, at the dog who thumped his tail once against the ground in what might have been encouragement. "Where?" she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Safe," Mother Ruth said firmly. "You're safe now, child. What's your name?" The girl was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might have drifted back into unconsciousness. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "Sarah May. Sarah May Caldwell." And in the way she said it, like an apology, Jake understood that he'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple rescue in the woods. The fire crackled and sparked as the women settled into what was clearly a familiar rhythm of care and vigilance. Blue's ears twitched at every sound from the forest beyond the clearing, and Jake found himself checking the shadows between the trees, wondering who might come looking for Sarah May Caldwell and what they might be willing to do to get her back. Dawn broke over the clearing with the kind of soft light that made everything look like it was painted in watercolors. Sarah May woke to the sound of women's voices and the smell of coffee brewing over the fire, her body aching in places she'd forgotten. Could hurt. She lay still under layers of quilts that smelled like lavender and wood smoke, trying to piece together how she'd gotten from the oak tree to this circle of strangers who treated her like she belonged. Mother Ruth knelt beside her with a tin, cupful of something that steamed and smelled like heaven. Chicory coffee with a little honey, she explained, helping Sarah May sit up slowly. Nothing fancy, but it'll put some strength back in your bones. Sarah May's hands shook as she accepted the cup, and she found herself studying the faces around. The fire with the wariness of someone who'd learned to expect the worst from most encounters. These women looked like they'd each fought their own battles and carried their own scars, but their eyes held something she'd almost forgotten existed. Kindness without conditions attached. "How long was I?" she began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the question. 3 days, said the red-haired woman who'd examined her wounds the night before. "I'm Maggie Sue, by the way. That's Emma over there making breakfast. And the tall one with the dark hair is Catherine. We've all been taking turns sitting with you." Jake emerged from the tree line, carrying an armload of firewood, Blue trotting along beside him with what looked suspiciously like a rabbit hanging from his jaws. The old dog had apparently decided that hunting was part of his new responsibilities, and from the approving nods of the women, this wasn't the first contribution he'd made to the camp's food supply. "Feeling better?" Jake asked, setting the wood down near the fire. His voice was gravelly from years of not using it much, but there was gentleness there that surprised her. Sarah May nodded, though everything still felt fragile, like she was made of glass and might shatter if someone spoke too loudly or moved too quickly. "I remember you cutting me down. Thank you." Jake shrugged, the way men did when they were uncomfortable with gratitude. "Couldn't very well leave you hanging there." Mother Ruth shot him a look that suggested there was more to talk about than polite conversation, and Jake seemed to understand. He moved to the far side of the fire, close enough to hear, but far enough away to give Sarah May space to tell her story if she chose to. "They say you're a Caldwell," Mother Ruth continued, her voice carefully neutral. "From the big white house, up on Mason Ridge." Sarah May's face went pale at the mention of the name, and her hands tightened around the coffee cup until her knuckles went white. "Was," she whispered. "I was a Caldwell." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Everyone in 3 counties knew the Caldwell name, knew the sprawling plantation house that sat on the hill like a monument to old money and older prejudices. Harold Caldwell owned half the businesses in town and most of the politicians who weren't already owned by someone else. His wife Margaret came from Charleston society and never let anyone forget it, and their son Thomas was being groomed to take over the family enterprises with the same iron fist his father used. "What happened, child?" Mother Ruth asked gently. Sarah May was quiet for so long that the fire consumed 2 more logs before she spoke. When the words finally came, they spilled out like water through a broken dam. "I fell in love," she said simply, "with someone they said wasn't suitable, someone who worked in their fields, picking tobacco and fixing fences for wages that barely covered food and rent. His name was David Running Bear, and he was Cherokee, and he was the kindest man I'd ever met." Jake's eyes flicked up from where he'd been whittling a piece of oak, his expression carefully neutral, but his attention completely focused. "David taught me things the fancy schools never bothered with," Sarah May continued. "How to read the weather in the way leaves turned, how to find medicinal plants in the woods, how to listen to what the land was trying to tell you. He had hands that could coax life from anything, broken horses, stubborn gardens, broken hearts." Her voice caught on the last words, and Maggie Sue moved closer, offering silent support. "When my parents found out we were meeting, they locked me in my room for 2 weeks. Said I was confused, that I'd been influenced by someone who didn't understand his place, but I wasn't confused. I knew exactly what I wanted, and it wasn't the life they had planned for me." Sarah May paused to take a shaky sip of coffee, gathering strength for the hardest part of the story. 3 months ago, they found a letter David had written me. Nothing scandalous, just sweet things. plans for a little house by the creek, talk about planting a garden together, dreams about children who would grow up knowing both sides of their heritage. Her eyes filled with tears that she wiped away. Angrily, Thomas took the letter to Sheriff Morrison, claimed David had been threatening me, forcing his attention on an unwilling white woman. Jake's whittling knife slipped, and he cursed under his breath. Everyone knew Sheriff Morrison was Harold Caldwell's hunting buddy and poker partner. Justice in Mason County had a way of bending toward whoever had the most land and the loudest voice in church on Sunday mornings. They came for David at dawn, Sarah May whispered. Didn't even pretend it was a proper arrest. Just dragged him out of his cabin and told him to run. Said they'd give him a 10-minute head start before they turned the dogs loose. The women around the fire exchanged grim looks. They'd all heard stories like this before. Stories that ended with someone disappearing into the night and never being seen again. Or bodies found weeks later in remote corners of the forest with no questions asked and no investigations launched. I tried to stop them, Sarah May continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. Stood between them and David, told them they were wrong about everything. That's when my father decided I was beyond saving, said I'd been corrupted, that I was a shame to the family name and the community. She gestured toward her throat, where faint rope marks still showed, purple against her pale skin. 2 days ago, Thomas came to my room with that rope and that sign, said they were going to stage my suicide, leave a note about how I couldn't live with the shame of what I'd done, make it look like I'd finally come to my senses and done the decent thing. Jake stood abruptly, his face darker than a storm cloud. But they couldn't go through with it. Thomas got scared when I stopped struggling, Sarah May said quietly. I think he realized that actually. Killing his own sister was different from talking about it. So they left me there half dead, figuring someone would find me eventually and finish what they started, or I'd die slow enough that they could claim it wasn't really their fault. Mother Ruth reached over and took Sarah May's hands in her weathered ones. And David? What happened to David? Sarah May's face crumpled. I don't know. No one's seen him since that morning. His cabin's been torn down, his horse is gone, and folks act like he never existed at all. Blue, who had been lying quietly at the edge of the firelight, suddenly lifted his head and growled low in his throat. His ears were pricked forward, focused on something beyond the trees that the humans couldn't yet hear. Jake was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the edge of the clearing with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd learned to trust a good dog's instincts. The women responded with their own practiced movements, banking the fire to reduce the light and gathering Sarah May into the center of their protective circle. In the distance, barely audible over the morning bird songs, came the sound of horses, moving through the forest and men's voices calling to each other. The voices carried the particular tone of people who were searching for something and expected to find it. Mother Ruth looked at Sarah May with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty to be surprised by any of it. Looks like your family's come calling, child. Question is, what do you want to do about it? Sarah May straightened her shoulders and wiped the last tears from her cheeks. For the first time since Jake had found her hanging from that oak tree, her voice carried the ring of determination instead of defeat. I want to live, she said simply. Whatever that takes, wherever that leads, I want to live. The sound of horses was getting closer now, and Blue's growl had turned into a barely contained snarl. Jake checked his rifle and exchanged a meaningful look with Mother Ruth, while the other women began moving with the quiet efficiency of people who'd prepared for this possibility long before it arrived. In the growing light of what promised to be a beautiful Kentucky morning, battle lines were being drawn in a clearing where 7 women, 1 broken girl, 1 silent hunter, and 1 old dog had decided that some things were worth defending, no matter what it cost. The horses emerged, from the tree line like something out of Sarah May's nightmares. 6 riders sat their mounts with the casual arrogance of men who'd never been told no and didn't expect to start hearing it now. Thomas Caldwell led the group, his expensive riding coat pristine despite the morning's journey through rough country. Behind him rode Sheriff Morrison, his badge catching the early sunlight, and 4 men Sarah May recognized as hands from the Caldwell Ranch. Jake stepped into the open space between the trees and the fire, his rifle held low but ready. Blue flanked him, the old dog's hackles raised and a rumble building deep in his chest that spoke of ancestors who'd hunted wolves and protected homesteads from things more dangerous than spoiled rich men. "Morning. Gentlemen," Jake called out, his voice carrying the deceptive calm of someone who'd faced worse odds and lived to tell about it. "You're on private land. Might want to turn those horses around and head back the way you came." Thomas urged his horse forward, his face flushed with anger and what looked like embarrassment. "We're looking for my sister, Sarah May. We have reason to believe she's in this area." "Can't say I've seen any lost sisters," Jake replied evenly. "But then again, I don't get much company out here." Sheriff Morrison shifted in his saddle, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Now listen here, boy. We've got a legal matter to resolve. The Caldwell girl has been missing for 3 days, and her family's worried sick about her welfare." Behind Jake, Mother Ruth emerged from the shadows between the trees, her silver hair gleaming like armor in the morning light. She moved with the dignity of someone who'd earned every line on her face and wasn't about to apologize for any of them. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising authority. "Funny how your concern for young women's welfare seems to come and go depending on who their families are." Morrison's face reddened at the barely concealed accusation in her tone. "Ruth Patterson, I might have known you'd be mixed up in this somehow. You and your collection of strays and troublemakers." "Strays and troublemakers," Mother Ruth repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what we're calling women who've been beaten by their husbands, thrown out by their families, or left with nothing when their men ran off with younger models? Interesting perspective, Sheriff." Thomas dismounted, his movements sharp with frustration. "Enough of this. Sarah May, I know you're here. Come out and let's talk about this like reasonable people." From her position behind the ring of women, Sarah May felt the familiar weight of her family's expectations settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. For 20 years, she'd responded to that tone, that assumption that she would comply simply because Thomas demanded it. But something had changed in the 3 days since she'd felt rope around her throat and chosen to keep breathing. She stepped into the firelight, her chin raised and her voice steady. "I'm here, Thomas. But we're not family anymore, so I don't see what there is to talk about." The transformation in Thomas's expression was immediate and ugly. The mask of concerned brother fell away, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You're coming home, Sarah May. This little tantrum has gone on long enough." "Home?" Sarah May laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean the place where you and Father decided I should die rather than embarrass the family name? That home?" Jake's grip tightened on his rifle as Thomas took a step forward. "You're confused, sister. You've been missing for days, probably hit your head when you fell off your horse. These people have been filling your mind with nonsense." "The only nonsense is thinking I'll ever set foot in that house again," Sarah May shot back. "I know what you did to David, and I know what you tried to do to me." Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat loudly. "Now see here, girl, you're making some serious accusations without a shred of proof. Your family came to me because they were worried about your mental state, and frankly, the things you're saying now just prove their point." Mother Ruth stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Mental state? Is that what we're calling it when a young woman refuses to accept her family's choice of husband? When she dares to fall in love with someone who doesn't meet their social requirements?" "You watch your tongue, old woman." One of the ranch hands growled. "You're talking about respectable people." "Respectable people," echoed Emma, the youngest. "Of the women who'd been silent until now. Like my husband, who broke my arm because the cornbread wasn't warm enough. Or Maggie Sue's father, who threw her out when she couldn't give him grandsons. That kind of respectable?" The ranch hands exchanged uncomfortable looks. They'd known these women when they were wives and daughters in the community, before circumstances had driven them to seek shelter in places that polite society preferred. To pretend didn't exist. Thomas's patience finally snapped. "Enough! Sarah May, you're coming with us now, willingly or otherwise. You're sick, you need help, and we're the only family you have." "Damn, she's got family right here," Jake said quietly, but his words carried across the clearing like a rifle shot. "And we don't abandon our own." The simple declaration hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd grown up in a world where family meant blood and obligation, where love was conditional and loyalty was purchased. The idea that strangers would claim his sister as their own, would protect her without expecting anything in return, was incomprehensible to him. "You have no legal right to keep her here," Sheriff Morrison blustered. "If you don't turn her over, right now I'll arrest the lot of you for kidnapping." Mother Ruth's smile was sharp as winter morning. "Kidnapping? Interesting charge, Sheriff. Considering we never took her anywhere, and she's free to leave any time she chooses." She turned to Sarah May. "Are you being held here against your will, child?" "No," Sarah May said clearly. "I'm exactly where I choose to be." Blue's growl intensified as Thomas took another step forward, and Jake shifted slightly to keep himself between the mounted men and the women. The old dog's instincts were screaming that violence was coming, and 40 years of hunting had taught Jake to trust those instincts completely. "Last chance, Sarah May," Thomas said, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used to threaten stable, boys and servants. "Come with us now, and we'll call this a misunderstanding. Stay here with these people, and you're no sister of mine." Sarah May felt something break loose inside her chest, something that had been wound tight for 20 years, of trying to be the daughter her family wanted instead of the woman she was. "Good," she said simply. "I never want to be your sister again." The words hit Thomas like a slap, and his carefully maintained control finally cracked. He lunged forward, clearly intending to grab Sarah May and drag her to his horse. But he'd forgotten about the old coonhound who'd been watching his every move with the focused attention of a predator. Blue moved like lightning despite his age, placing himself directly in Thomas's path with a snarl that promised serious consequences for anyone stupid enough to test him. Thomas stumbled backward, his expensive boots sliding on the damp ground, and nearly fell before catching himself against a tree. "Call off your dog," Sheriff Morrison barked, his hand now openly gripping his pistol. "Not my dog," Jake replied, calmly. "He's his own man, but I'd suggest your friend there learn some manners before he tries that again." The standoff stretched taut as a fiddle string, 6 armed men facing 2 women, 1 broken girl, 1 quiet hunter, and 1 old dog who'd decided he had something worth fighting for. The morning air hummed with tension and the promise of violence that could spill blood across the peaceful clearing. Then, from somewhere in the forest behind the mounted men, came a sound that changed everything. The clear, haunting notes of a wooden flute playing a Cherokee courting song that Sarah May had heard only once before, on a summer evening when the world still held the possibility of happiness. Thomas spun in his saddle, his face going white as he recognized the melody. Sheriff Morrison's horse danced nervously as the music seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, weaving through the trees like smoke. "David," Sarah May whispered, her hand pressed to her heart. And in that single word, everything Jake had suspected about this story, Everything Mother Ruth had seen in the girl's eyes, and everything the old dog had been guarding against finally came into focus. The real battle was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than anyone had imagined. The flute music stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving a silence so complete that every person in the clearing could hear their own heartbeat. Thomas's horse sidled nervously beneath him, sensing his rider's growing panic, while Sheriff Morrison's hand tightened on his pistol grip with the reflexive motion of a man who'd learned to shoot first and ask questions later. From the trees on the far side of the clearing stepped a figure that made Sarah May's breath catch in her throat. David Running Bear moved like flowing water, his dark hair longer than she remembered, his clothes showing the wear of 3 months spent living rough in the mountains. But his eyes, those warm brown eyes that had taught her to see beauty in simple things, were exactly as she remembered them. He carried the wooden flute in one hand and nothing else, but there was something in his posture that suggested he wasn't as defenseless as he appeared. Behind him, barely visible among the shadows, other figures moved with the silent grace of people who belonged to the forest more than to any town or settlement. "Sarah May," David said simply, and his voice carried all the tenderness and relief that 3 months of uncertainty could hold. She took a step toward him, then another, and suddenly she was running across the clearing with tears streaming down her face. When she reached him, he caught her in arms that felt like coming home after the longest journey of her life. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed against his chest. "They said you ran, that you were gone forever." David's arms tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Takes more than a handful of cowards to kill a running bear. My grandfather didn't survive the Trail of Tears just to have his bloodline end because some rich man's son can't stand the idea of his sister choosing her own path." Thomas found his voice first, though it came out higher than he'd intended. "You're supposed to be gone. We told you to leave and never come back." David's eyes, still holding Sarah May close, were colder than Winter Creek water when they fixed on Thomas. "You told a lot of lies, Thomas Caldwell. But the biggest one was thinking I'd abandon the woman I love just because you couldn't handle the truth of what love looks like." Sheriff Morrison's horse danced backward as more figures emerged from the forest. Cherokee men and women, some young, some old, all carrying themselves with the quiet dignity of people who'd learned to survive in a world that had tried its best to erase them. There were perhaps a dozen of them, and while none appeared to be armed, there was something in their collective presence that suggested weapons wouldn't be necessary. An older Cherokee woman stepped forward, her gray hair braided with silver, ornaments that caught the morning light. She moved to stand beside Mother Ruth, and the two women exchanged a look of mutual respect that spoke of shared understanding across cultural lines. "I am Mary Kingfisher," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "David is my nephew, and Sarah May is under our protection, as well as yours." Mother Ruth nodded slowly. "Ruth Patterson, these are my girls, and this is our land. Seems like we've got common cause here." Sheriff Morrison's face had gone from red to purple as he realized he was facing not just a handful of isolated women, but what appeared to be an alliance between outcasts that he'd never suspected existed. "This is highly irregular. You people have no legal standing in this matter." Mary Kingfisher's smile was sharp as flint. "Legal standing? How interesting that you mentioned the law, Sheriff. I wonder if you'd be interested in discussing the legal standing of attempting to lynch someone without trial, or perhaps the legal implications of destroying property that belongs to members of a federally recognized tribe." The color drained from Thomas's face as the implications of her words sank in. David's cabin hadn't just been torn down. It had been on land that belonged to the Cherokee Nation through treaties that were older than Kentucky statehood. Jake, who had been watching this exchange with the keen attention of someone trying to read the wind before a storm, stepped closer. to the group of mounted men. "Seems like you gentlemen might have bitten off more than you can chew," he observed mildly. "Might be a good time to reconsider your options." But Thomas was past the point of rational consideration. The sight of his sister in the arms of the man he'd tried to eliminate, surrounded by people who clearly saw her as worth protecting, had pushed him beyond anger into something approaching madness. "She's my sister," he snarled, dismounting and taking several steps toward the group. "My blood, my responsibility, my choice to make." "No," Sarah May said, pulling back from David but keeping one hand firmly clasped in his. "I'm my own person, and I choose David. I choose this life, these people, this love. You can't make me be someone I'm not anymore." The raw honesty in her voice seemed to hit Thomas like a physical blow. For 20 years, he'd never questioned his right to make decisions for his sister, never doubted that family authority trumped individual desire. The idea that she might have legitimate feelings and choices of her own was foreign to everything he'd been taught about the natural order of things. "You don't know what you're saying," he insisted, his voice taking on a pleading quality that was somehow more frightening than his anger. "You're confused, traumatized. These people have filled your head with ideas that go against everything you were raised to believe." David stepped protectively in front of Sarah May, though his posture remained non-threatening. "She knows exactly what she's saying. Maybe that's what scares you." The truth of those words seemed to break something in Thomas. He lunged forward with a wild swing aimed at David's face, but the Cherokee man moved like water around the clumsy attack, catching Thomas's wrist and using his own momentum to send him sprawling face first in the dirt. Sheriff Morrison's pistol cleared leather with a metallic whisper, but before he could bring it to bear, Blue was there, not attacking, but positioning himself directly between the weapon and the people he'd chosen to protect. The old dog's message was clear. Anyone who wanted to hurt his people would have to go through him first. "That's enough!" Mother Ruth's voice cracked across the clearing like a whip, stopping everyone in their tracks. "Sheriff Morrison, you put that gun away before someone gets hurt who doesn't deserve it. Thomas Caldwell, you get up off the ground and start acting like you've got some sense." There was something in her tone that spoke to childhood memories of authority figures who demanded respect and usually got it. Sheriff Morrison found himself holstering his weapon almost involuntarily, while Thomas struggled to his feet with dirt streaking his expensive clothes. "This isn't over," Thomas said, but his voice had lost most of its conviction. "Sarah May, when you come to your senses, when you realize what kind of life these people are offering you, you'll remember that you've got family who loves you." Sarah May looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Thomas, you don't love me. You love the idea of controlling me. There's a difference, even if you can't see it." Mary Kingfisher moved closer to her nephew and the young woman who had become part of their extended family through choice rather than blood. "The morning is wearing on," she observed calmly. "Perhaps it's time for everyone to go where they belong." Sheriff Morrison gathered his reins with hands that weren't quite steady. He'd come here expecting to collect a runaway girl and return her to her rightful place in the social order. Instead, he'd stumbled into something that challenged every assumption he'd made about how the world was supposed to work. "This isn't finished," he said, but the words lacked the force of real threat. "There are laws about harboring runaways, about interfering with family matters. And there are laws about attempted murder," Jake replied quietly. "About destroying property, about making false accusations. Seems like there might be enough blame to go around if folks want to start talking about laws." The mounted men turned their horses toward the tree line, but Thomas lingered for a moment longer, staring at his sister with an expression that mixed hurt and bewilderment with something that might have been the first glimmer of understanding. "I really believed I was protecting you," he said quietly. Sarah May met his eyes without flinching. "I know you did, but protecting someone and controlling them aren't the same thing. Maybe someday you'll understand the difference." As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, the clearing seemed to exhale collectively. David pulled Sarah May close again, and she melted into his embrace with the relief of someone who'd finally found safe harbor after being lost at sea. "Is it really over?" she asked against his chest. Mary Kingfisher and Mother Ruth exchanged a long look, two women who'd seen enough of life to know that some battles end with the first confrontation, while others are just beginning. "For now," Mother Ruth said carefully, "but men like your father and brother don't give up easily, especially when they think their reputation is at stake. We'll need to be ready for whatever comes next." David nodded grimly, his arms still protective around Sarah May. "My people have been getting ready for whatever comes next for more than 100 years. We're not going anywhere." As the sun climbed higher over the Kentucky hills, painting the clearing in shades of gold and green, two communities that had found common cause began the careful work of planning for an uncertain future. But for the first time in months, Sarah May Caldwell felt like she might actually have a future worth planning for. 2 weeks passed in the clearing with a peace that felt almost like a gift from heaven. Sarah May learned to weave baskets from river reeds under Mary Kingfisher's patient guidance, while David helped Jake repair the winter shelters that the women had built in the deeper woods. Blue had appointed himself official guardian of the entire community, making regular patrols around the perimeter and accepting ear scratches from anyone who offered them. But peace, Sarah May had learned, was often just the quiet before a different kind of storm. The trouble started with a boy from town, no more than 14, who stumbled into their clearing on a Tuesday morning with his face streaked with tears and his clothes torn from running through brambles. Mother Ruth recognized him immediately as Billy Morrison, the sheriff's youngest son, and the expression on her face suggested she knew this wasn't a social call. "Please," Billy gasped, falling to his knees beside the fire where the women were preparing their morning meal. "You have to help. They're coming, and they're not just coming to talk this time." Sarah May felt her stomach drop like a stone into dark water. "Who's coming, Billy?" "Your father," the boy said, his voice shaking. "He came to our house last night with papers from the judge in Louisville, legal papers that say you're mentally incompetent, that you need to be committed to the state hospital for your own protection." David's hands stilled on the arrow he'd been fletching. "What kind of papers?" Billy wiped his nose on his sleeve, struggling to remember details through his panic. "Something called a writ of habeas corpus, and another one that gives your father legal guardianship over you until you're declared competent by state. Doctors." Mary Kingfisher set down her weaving with careful precision. "And your father agreed to enforce these papers?" Billy's face crumpled with shame. "He said he didn't have a choice. Said federal judges trump local decisions, and if he didn't cooperate, they'd have his badge, and maybe worse. But I heard him talking to my mother afterward, and he's scared. Real scared." Jake emerged from the tree line where he'd been checking, his snares, Blue trotting beside him with the alert posture of a dog who'd sensed danger on the wind. "How many men are we talking about, son?" 25, maybe 30, Billy said miserably. "Deputies from 3 counties, plus federal marshals from Louisville. They've got a wagon for—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what the wagon was for. Sarah May sank onto a fallen log, the weight of inevitability settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She dared to hope that her family would eventually accept her choice, that the legal complications David's tribal status created would be enough to protect them. But Harold Caldwell hadn't built his fortune by accepting defeat gracefully. "When?" she asked quietly. "Noon," Billy replied. "Maybe sooner. They were saddling up when I slipped out of the house." Mother Ruth looked around the circle of faces, reading the mixture of fear and determination in each one. These women had fled abusive husbands, judgmental families, and communities that saw them as disposable. They'd found refuge in this hidden place and built something worth protecting, but protecting it against 30 armed men was a different proposition entirely. "You could run," she said to Sarah, May, and David. "Head up into the high country, cross into Virginia or Tennessee. Start fresh somewhere they'd never think to look." David shook his head firmly. "Running just means they win. Means they get to tell the story their way, make Sarah May into the crazy woman who needed to be locked up for her own good. Besides," Sarah May added, her voice gaining strength, "running means leaving all of you, and I won't do that. You saved my life, all of you. I won't abandon the family I chose just to save myself from the family I was born into." Mary Kingfisher stood slowly, her weathered hands smoothing down her skirt with deliberate calm. "Then we fight, not with guns or violence, but with truth, with witnesses who can't be bought or intimidated." "What do you mean?" Jake asked. "I mean we make this a public matter instead of a private one," she replied. "Billy, can you get word to the newspaper man in town, the one who's been writing about Indian affairs and federal overreach?" Billy nodded eagerly. "Mr. Patterson from the county paper. He's my neighbor, but what should I tell him?" "Tell him that federal marshals are about to forcibly commit a young woman to a state hospital without a proper hearing or medical examination," Mother Ruth said. "Tell him they're doing it based on papers signed by a judge who's never met her, on the word of a family that has clear financial reasons for wanting her declared incompetent." David's eyes lit up with understanding. "And tell him that they're doing it on Cherokee land, violating treaties that guarantee our people legal protection from state interference." Sarah May felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. "You think it will work? Might not stop them today," Jake said pragmatically, "but it'll make them think twice about how they go about it. Hard to disappear someone when half the county's watching." As if summoned by their conversation, the distant sound of many horses moving through the forest began to filter through the morning air. Blue's ears pricked forward, and he moved to position himself between the approaching sounds and the people he'd sworn to protect. Billy jumped to his feet. "I have to go. If they figure out I warned you, my father will lose his job for sure." Mother Ruth caught his arm gently. "Billy Morrison, you're a good boy with a good heart. Don't let anyone tell you different." The boy flushed with pride at the praise, then disappeared into the forest with the silent speed of someone who'd spent his life exploring these hills. The remaining time passed too quickly and not quickly enough. The women moved with practiced efficiency, banking fires and securing anything that might be damaged in a confrontation. David and the other Cherokee men took positions around the clearing's perimeter, not to fight, but to witness, to ensure that whatever happened would be seen and remembered. Sarah May found herself standing in the center of the clearing, wearing a simple blue dress that Mary Kingfisher had given her, her hair braided back with ribbon that caught the morning light. She looked nothing like the broken girl Jake had found hanging from an oak tree, and everything like a woman who'd found her strength in the most unlikely places. When the horses finally emerged from the tree line, they came like a small army. Federal marshals in their dark uniforms, county deputies with nervous expressions, and at the front of the group, Harold Caldwell himself, sitting his horse like a man who'd never doubted his right to take whatever he wanted. But there were other horses too, unexpected ones. Mr. Patterson from the county newspaper, his camera equipment strapped to his saddle. Dr. Samuel Wright, the only physician in 3 counties who wasn't beholden to the Caldwell family fortune. And most surprising of all, Reverend Joshua Hamilton, the Methodist minister whose sermons about Christian charity had apparently inspired him to witness whatever was about to unfold. Harold Caldwell's face darkened when he saw the additional observers, but the federal marshal beside him leaned over and murmured something that made the older man's jaw tighten with barely controlled fury. "Sarah May Caldwell," the marshal called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. I'm Marshal William Thompson, and I have a court order requiring your immediate transport to the state hospital in Louisville for psychiatric evaluation. Sarah May stepped forward, her chin raised and her voice steady. On what grounds, Marshal Thompson? On grounds that you've been declared mentally incompetent by persons with legal authority to make such determinations, he replied, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the assignment. And who made this determination? Dr. Wright called out, spurring his horse closer to the group. I don't recall conducting any examination of Miss Caldwell. Harold Caldwell's face went red. Samuel, this is none of your concern. My daughter is ill, and we're getting her the help she needs. Dr. Wright's eyes were steady as they fixed on the older man. Harold, I've been the family physician for the Caldwells for 15 years. I delivered this girl, treated her childhood illnesses, and saw her through pneumonia when she was 12. In all that time, I've never seen evidence of any mental instability. That was before she became involved with undesirable elements, Harold shot back, before she started making irrational decisions that put herself and others at risk. Reverend Hamilton urged his horse forward, his voice carrying the moral authority that had made him respected throughout the county. Harold, I've known your family for 20 years. I baptized this girl, confirmed her in the faith, and watched her grow into a thoughtful, compassionate young woman. The only thing that seems to have changed is that she's made choices you disapprove of. The marshal looked increasingly uncomfortable as the situation grew more complex than he'd been led to expect. Sir, I have legal documents signed by a federal judge. Personal opinions about the subject's character don't change my obligations under the law. Mary Kingfisher stepped forward, her voice carrying a different kind of authority entirely. Marshal Thompson, this clearing sits on land guaranteed to the Cherokee Nation by the Treaty of New Echota. Federal law requires that any law enforcement actions taken on our territory be coordinated with tribal authorities. Were you planning to honor that requirement? The marshal's face went pale as he realized he'd stumbled into a jurisdictional nightmare that could end his career if handled incorrectly. Federal treaties with Indian nations were complex legal territory that most local lawmen preferred to avoid entirely. I wasn't informed that this was tribal land, he said slowly. Ignorance of the law isn't generally considered an excuse, David observed mildly, especially when the law you're ignoring is federal treaty obligation. Mr. Patterson was busily taking notes and photographing the scene, clearly recognizing a story that could have implications far beyond one family's domestic dispute. The federal government forcing a Cherokee community to surrender someone under their protection would make headlines from Louisville to Washington. Sarah May felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, with her future hanging in the space between competing authorities and conflicting laws. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone in facing down the forces that wanted to control her destiny. Marshal Thompson, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength, I submit to you that I'm not mentally incompetent, that I am here of my own free will, and that I am under the protection of a sovereign nation with which the United States maintains treaty obligations. If you wish to remove me from this place, you'll need to do so by force, in front of witnesses, in violation of federal law. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of horses shifting nervously and the scratch of Mr. Patterson's pen against paper. Marshal Thompson looked at Harold Caldwell with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. And in that moment of perfect tension, with the future hanging in the balance, everyone waited to see who would blink first. Marshal Thompson sat his horse in silence for what felt like an eternity, his gaze moving from Sarah May to the gathered witnesses, to the legal papers in his hand, and finally to Harold Caldwell's increasingly desperate expression. The morning sun had climbed high enough to cast sharp shadows across the clearing, and somewhere in the forest, a mockingbird began running through its repertoire of borrowed songs. "Mr. Caldwell," the marshal said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "I believe there may have been some misunderstandings about the circumstances of this case." Harold's face went from red to purple. "What misunderstandings? You have the papers right there, signed by Judge Morrison himself. My daughter is mentally incompetent and requires immediate hospitalization." "Judge Morrison," Dr. Wright repeated thoughtfully. "That would be Judge Harrison Morrison, Sheriff Morrison's older brother?" He looked directly at the marshal. "The same Judge Morrison who owes Harold Caldwell considerable money from failed real estate investments?" The marshal's expression grew, darker by the moment as he began to understand the depth of the political manipulation he'd been drawn into. Federal marshals were supposed to be above local politics and family feuds, but it appeared he'd been used as a pawn in exactly that kind of corruption. Reverend Hamilton urged his horse closer to Sarah May, his weathered face kind but serious. "Sarah May, I need to ask you directly, in front of all these witnesses. Are you here against your will?" "No, Reverend," she replied clearly. "I'm here because these people saved my life when my own family tried to end it." "And are you in your right mind? Do you understand the choices you're making?" Sarah May's smile was radiant as sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "I understand them better than I've ever understood anything in my life. I choose love over duty, truth over reputation, and freedom over the safety of a gilded cage." Mr. Patterson looked up from his notepad. "Marshal Thompson, for my readers' benefit, could you explain under what federal authority you're operating here? Specifically, what gives a Kentucky judge jurisdiction over actions taken on Cherokee tribal land?" The marshal's silence stretched, long enough for everyone to understand that he didn't have a good answer to that question. Treaty law was complex, but the basic principle was clear. State authorities had limited jurisdiction on sovereign tribal territory, and federal authorities needed specific cause to override tribal sovereignty. Thomas Caldwell, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly dismounted and walked toward his sister with slow, deliberate steps. Everyone tensed, but there was something different in his posture, something less aggressive than defeated. "Sarah May," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." She waited, her hand finding David's and holding tight. "Were you really going to, that day, when Jake found you? Were you really going to do what we said you were going to do?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah May looked at her brother, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her life, seeing the frightened boy beneath the angry man. "No, Thomas," she said gently, "I was never going to do that. You and Father hung me from that tree because you couldn't stand the thought of me choosing my own life. You left me there to die because it was easier than admitting you might be wrong about what love looks like." Thomas's face crumpled as the full weight of what they'd done hit him like a physical blow. "Oh God, oh my God, what did we do?" "Harold," Caldwell's voice cracked like a whip across the clearing. "Thomas, get back here. Don't let these people confuse you with their lies." But Thomas wasn't listening to his father anymore. He was staring at his sister with eyes that were seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time since they were children playing in the woods behind the big house. "You really love him," he said, looking at David with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "This isn't rebellion or madness. You really love him." "With all my heart," Sarah May confirmed. Thomas turned to look at David, taking in the quiet strength, the protective way he stood close to Sarah May without trying to overshadow her. The calm dignity with which he faced down 30 armed men. "And you love her?" "Enough to die for her," David replied simply. "But more than that, enough to live for her, to build something worth having with her." Thomas nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. He walked back to his horse and climbed into the saddle, But instead of taking his place beside his father, he rode to a position between the federal marshals and the clearing's defenders. "Marshal Thompson," he said, his voice carrying across the morning air with surprising authority, "I withdraw any complaint my family has made about my sister's mental state. As far as I'm concerned, she's exactly where she belongs." Harold Caldwell's explosion of rage could probably be heard in the next county. "Thomas, you ungrateful, traitorous boy! She's your sister, your blood!" "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "She is. And I almost killed her because I was too proud and too stupid to see that she's also her own person, with her own heart and her own choices to make." Mary Kingfisher stepped forward, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd seen families torn apart by pride and prejudice before. "Marshal Thompson, it seems to me that this is a family matter that families need to work out for themselves. Federal law enforcement has more important things to do than forcing adult women to live with relatives who've proven they're willing to harm them." Marshal Thompson looked at the legal papers in his hand as if they'd turned into snakes. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm going to need some time to review the jurisdiction issues that have been raised here. Until I can get clarification from Louisville, I'm not prepared to take any action." It was a face-saving way of saying that he had no intention of turning this political mess into a career-ending disaster, and everyone understood it as such. Harold Caldwell sat his horse like a man who'd watched his carefully constructed world collapse around him. "This isn't over," he said, but the words had no force behind them. "Sarah May, when you realize what kind of life you're choosing, what kind of hardships these people can offer you, you'll remember that you have a real family waiting for you." Sarah May looked at the man who'd fathered her with something that might have been pity. "I already have a real family, Father. I'm looking at them." And with that simple declaration, the last threads holding her to her old life finally snapped. She was free, not because authority had granted her freedom, but because she'd claimed it for herself and found people willing to stand with her in that claim. As the federal marshals and county deputies began the complex process of extricating themselves from a situation that had grown far more complicated than anyone had anticipated, the witnesses who'd come to observe stayed to celebrate. Dr. Wright examined Sarah May and pronounced her in excellent physical and mental health. Reverend Hamilton offered to perform a marriage ceremony right there in the clearing if the couple desired it. Mr. Patterson took photographs and notes that would eventually become a story about federal overreach, tribal sovereignty, and the courage of individuals who chose love over law. 6 months later, the clearing had been transformed into something that looked almost like a proper settlement. David and Sarah May had built a cabin at the forest's edge, close enough to the community for mutual support, but far enough away for privacy. Blue had claimed a spot on their front porch where he could keep watch over his extended family while enjoying the luxury of regular meals and ear scratches. Mother Ruth's community had grown to include women from 3 counties who'd heard about a place where they could start over without judgment. Mary Kingfisher had established a trading post that brought Cherokee crafts and herbs to the wider community, while providing a bridge between 2 cultures that had too often seen each other as enemies. Thomas Caldwell had shocked everyone by leaving his father's business and opening a small law practice that specialized in helping people navigate the complex intersections of federal, state, and tribal law. He'd never quite been able to bring himself to visit his sister's home, but he'd made sure that Harold's efforts to legally harass the community went nowhere. And Harold himself? He'd grown old quickly after losing both his children to what he saw as incomprehensible choices. The big house on Mason Ridge felt empty and echoing, filled with the ghosts of conversations that would never happen and grandchildren he'd never know. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Jake had found her hanging from an oak tree, Sarah May stood in her garden harvesting the last of the season's vegetables. David was splitting firewood nearby, while Blue supervised from the shade of an apple tree that had been heavy with fruit just weeks before. She paused in her work to watch a young Cherokee woman teaching her daughter to weave baskets, while Mother, Ruth, showed a recently arrived widow how to preserve vegetables for winter storage. This place had become something none of them had imagined when they'd first gathered around a fire to protect one broken girl. It had become proof that chosen family could be stronger than blood, that love could triumph over law, and that courage could bloom in the most unlikely soil. Jake emerged from the forest, carrying a string of fish and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd had a successful morning on the creek. He'd built himself a small cabin on the far side of the clearing and had become something like the community's unofficial guardian, teaching the younger men to hunt and fish while learning from the Cherokee elders about reading the land's subtle messages. "Good day for it," he called out, holding up his catch. "Every day's a good day when you're where you belong," Sarah May replied, and the simple truth of those words seemed to hang in the autumn air like a blessing. As the sun set over the Kentucky hills, painting the clearing in shades of gold and crimson, the community gathered around their fire as they did most evenings. Stories were told, songs were sung, and children who were learning to see the world as a place where different kinds of people could live together in peace played at the edges of the firelight. Blue, now grayer around the muzzle but still alert to his responsibilities, made his evening patrol around the perimeter before settling down beside the fire with a contented sigh. He'd found his pack, and his pack had found their place, and in the end, that was enough for any creature to call their life complete. And in that perfect moment, as the fire crackled and the night sounds of the forest began their ancient symphony, Sarah May understood that some stories don't end with triumph or tragedy, but with the quiet satisfaction of people who've learned to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their lives. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't conquering your enemies, but transforming them into something better than they were. Sometimes the most profound revolution happens not in the halls of power, but around a simple fire where people choose to see each other as human beings worthy of love and respect. As the stars emerged one by one in the Kentucky sky, the community settled into the peaceful routine of people who'd found their way home to each other. And if you were to visit that clearing today, you might still find traces of the garden Sarah May planted, still find descendants of the apple tree that David grafted, still find echoes of the laughter and love that proved stronger than all the forces that tried to tear it down. Because some things, once they take root in the right soil, grow strong enough to last forever. In a world that often seems divided by fear and misunderstanding, stories like this remind us that love, really, can triumph over hatred, that courage can bloom in the most unlikely places, and that the families we choose can be stronger than the ones we're born into. If this tale of redemption and hope has touched your heart, consider sharing it with others who might need to remember that transformation is always possible, that second chances are real, and that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from the darkest soil. Like this story to let others discover it, leave a comment about your own experiences with chosen family and unexpected courage, and subscribe to make sure you never miss another tale of how ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they choose love over fear.